Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this panel. We will now present a welcome greeting from Secretary Tahisha Way. Thank you.
Greetings. I'm pleased to welcome you to Never Forget the Slave Trade and Middle Passage on New Jersey Shores. This event is proudly hosted by the New Jersey Historical Commission, which is a division within the Department of State, dedicated to the advancement of public knowledge and preservation of New Jersey's history. In the 18th century, New Jersey's shores, specifically Perth Amboy and Camden, were middle passage points of entry, where enslaved people were brought from Africa to be sold for auction. These sites were just 2 of the 52 locations across the United States where children, women, and men first placed their feet after the injustice of being taken from Africa. In 1994, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO, established the Slave Route Project to address ignorance and concealment of the history of slavery, the movements to resist it, and its abolition. And just last year, the Perth Amboy City Council chose to join the UNESCO Slave Route Project by voting to place a historical marker at the Perth Amboy ferry slip, designating the location as a site of memory. This marker commemorates the lives of enslaved Africans, those who perished and those who survived, who were forced to endure the transatlantic journey known as the Middle Passage. Now, today's panel is an opportunity to explore the same history with esteemed guests from the Middle Passage Ceremonies, Port Markers Project, and Camden County Historical Society. In our historical programming, we always seek to recognize those in our communities who are engaged in historical storytelling. We are so pleased to welcome R.J. Mcdowell, the daughter of New Jersey's beloved poet and author, Sandra Turner Barnes, who passed away this year. R.J. will recite poems in honor of her mother. In closing, thank you to our panelists, the tremendous team at our New Jersey Historical Commission, notably Executive Director Sarah Curitan and Noelle Williams, Director of the African American History Programs. Finally, thank you to our audience joining us live or viewing this program later. We are grateful to share this history and important conversation with you.
Thank you, Secretary Way. And welcome again, everyone. I have to say, and a special thanks to Secretary Tahisha Way for her ongoing leadership. Secretary Way serves as New Jersey's top election official, overseeing the State Division of Elections and its work in securing our democracy and ensuring broad, fair access to the right to vote. Ms. Way also oversees the state government's offices, including the New Jersey Historical Commission, supporting New Jersey's vibrant arts, culture, history, and business communities. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noelle Lorraine Williams, and I am the director of the African American History Program. I'm delighted to welcome you to this program. Never forget the slave trade and Middle Passage on New Jersey shores. Thank you to our panelists, the staff of the New Jersey Historical Commission, especially Executive Director Sarah Curitan, the Chief Communications Officer, Greer Luce. The commission works to advance the use and advance the public knowledge and preservation of New Jersey history. We believe that an understanding of our shared heritage is essential to sustaining a cohesive and robust democracy. Please join me in welcoming our first two panelists. Mr. Derek Davis is an Assistant Vice President of TD Bank. He's a trustee of the Camden County Historical Society and a passionate advocate for uncovering New Jersey's lesser known stories of the history of slavery in our state. When Mr. Davis learned that there were 3 slave auction sites in Camden at the former ferry boat landings along the Delaware River, he applied to the Historical Commission Grant Program and was awarded funds to erect prominent interpretive markers on the sites. The first Ancestral Remembrance ceremony was held on November 27, 2017, with the United States Senator Cory Booker as the keynote speaker. The ceremony and dedication received national attention by the press during a highly polarized period of national debate over Confederate monuments. The second ceremony and dedication featured Stedman Graham as the keynote speaker, as well as New Jersey Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver and New Jersey Secretary of State Tahisha Way. The third and final dedication was planned for last spring, but was interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. R.J. Mcdowell is the daughter of New Jersey's beloved poet and author, Sandra Turner Barnes. Ms. Mcdowell is a veteran of the United States Air Force and has more than 20 years of experience in both federal and commercial contracting. Mrs. Mcdowell has also co-founded a startup, Melanin E-Commerce, that has created cryptocurrency for the African American community. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Derek Davis.
Good evening all. Noelle, I don't know if they're gonna start the video of Pomona Hall now. Okay. Good evening. I'm Derek Davis, a board member of the Camden County Historical Society. This is a photo of my great-great-grandfather, Henry Mathis, taken in 1895. He was born in Greenville, Butler County, Alabama, as was his wife, an enslaved mulatto African. I now understand I too am Henry Mathis, but more on that later. People often think about how we're shaped by our biological DNA of our ancestors, but they forget how much we're shaped by historical DNA. When most people think of slavery, they envision a southern plantation with 50 or more enslaved Africans. Not so. New Jersey slavery was as common as any in Alabama in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The video watching now is Pomona Hall in Camden. Through this doorway and down these stairs, enslaved people entered daily. I'm standing in the living quarters of the room you're seeing now in the video, on the 3rd floor, one of the few places of personal space for the not known how many enslaved Africans were staying in this room. There's a room, as you see this wall that divides the 2 rooms. One room, they actually divided the indentured servants that we know from records. There were 6 held here from the enslaved Africans. Heating, if any, was provided by heat boxes made of cast iron carried up the stairs. Small windows were the only source of air and ventilation during summer months in the hottest portion of the mansion. Heat rises. For the mansion staff, eating was only permitted in the kitchen or in the upstairs area where I'm hosting this from presently. Enslaved field workers lived outside in separate quarters. Both field and in-house enslaved Africans were restricted to the same outhouse. How these New Jersey markers acknowledging the state's historical connection to slavery come to fruition. In June of 2014, I was reading a Philadelphia Inquirer article, which told the story of the Haddon Heights Historical Society slave marker being taken down by the county government at the bequest of a judge. He lived near the marker. One marker was vandalized and destroyed, and mind you, the upper middle class neighborhood. I was appalled, and I wrote a letter to the editor. That letter read, studying history where it happened, we should all be ashamed of the callous and cavalier attitude taken by some Haddon Heights residents towards the installation of memorial plaques to enslaved African Americans. According to the mayor, Ed Forte, the slavery issue seems to have upset people. Forte also suggested that a library might be a more fitting place to acknowledge this history. But I humbly submit, the American people are not willing to remove the Martin Luther King Jr. statue or the Lincoln Memorial or the Philadelphia President's House from their historic locations. All locations used should be on historic grounds for comparison's sake. I'm not a resident of Haddon Heights, so I don't know the real reason people are upset. I'm quite certain, however, that my great-great-grandfather, born in Greenville, Alabama, was quite upset over being enslaved, as were 4 million other African Americans. While reading this rebuttal, I had an epiphany like no other in my life. Thus, I joined the Historical Society, and I learned of 3 auction points in Camden, because the New Jersey colony imposed no tariffs for 40 years importation of enslaved Americans were duty-free, enabling merchants and shippers to bypass nearby New York and Pennsylvania. In response to this information, I wanted to bring pride and dignity to those who have only known degradation and deprivation. In 2014, I submitted a grant request for markers to the New Jersey Historical Commission. It would be the first of its kind in the state of New Jersey. It was denied. In 2015, I submitted a second application, and it too was denied. In 2016, the year Governor Murphy took office, I was finally awarded a grant to forge these 3 markers. This grant, coupled with that of my employer, TD Bank, to the tune of 5 figures, I might add, paved the way for the first unveiling in November of 2017. This initial installation was at the northeast corner of Cooper and Front Street, right in front of the Johnson Park, on Ruckus Camden, in the front of the Whitman House, where ferries bearing newly raped African landed as early as 2017. The keynote speaker was our very own New Jersey Senator Cory A. Booker. Let's take a look.
Now it is a great honor to have with us our United States Senator Cory A. Booker, who is a friend and an outstanding senator and our leader. And so we're real glad to have you here. So please come on.
This is a very powerful moment for me. This is a very powerful moment for Camden. But please know what we do here echoes throughout our nation at a time of urgency when it comes to recognizing the truth of our country. And please know what we do here now is a sacred occasion because it elevates the voices of our history that so many attempts have been made to silence, to erase, to obscure, to pervert. I give my love today to the Camden Historical Society because you all are literally doing not just God's work, but are showing a level of patriotism that is so urgently needed right now in our nation. Take the program now, turn it over, and you see this song written by James Weldon Johnson. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. The challenge we have in America right now is that we are not dipping into the richness of our history to tell the truth that is necessary for us to make it into a brighter future for all. History matters. And the challenge is, as people try to obscure history and erase history, they have an assault on our history. We lose those cords that are necessary now to bind up this nation and make us one and unified. They are doing an assault not just on historical figures of importance, but they're assaulting the very ideals of our country. They're assaulting ourselves. When you sanitize and you homogenize American history, what you do to it is you lessen the greatness of our country. You diminish the greatness of individuals who overcame bigotry, who overcame hate, who overcame outrageous obstacles to bring us to where we are today. When you tell the truth about hate and bigotry and violence and suppression and slavery, when you tell those truths, you begin to see today with its greater glory. The next line says, sing a song full of the hope that the present has taught us. We are here today because of heroic people from our past. So today what we do is we tell the truth of who we are at a time where people are trying to bring about revisionist history. They're trying to take treasonous traitors and elevate them to high pedestals in our time and trying to tell a different truth, a lie about our past. It is time for truth telling in America. It is time for glory and the greatness. And so now the call of us is not just to place these honored markers on that sacred soil. The call of our country now to us is to tell this truth, is to bring light to the darkness, is to speak the names of people who had their names stolen from them. This is the call of this generation of America because there's work to do in this country. There's wounds we need to heal and stitch. There's ties that we need to bind tight. There's only one way forward. It's the call from other songs in our nation. And I believe that when we put markers like this, if we do the work of teaching the history, we in the United States of America will have a truth that goes marching on. Thank you.
Now it is a great honor.
Dignity. The second marker was located at the corner of Federal Street and Jersey Joe Walcott Boulevard, formerly Delaware Avenue, where captives were brought by ferry to the colonial era waterline between 1751 and the early 1760s. Stedman Graham was the keynote speaker, and in attendance were New Jersey Secretary of State Way and our Lieutenant Governor, Sheila Oliver. I spoke to Stedman a few times today, and I never even told him this story. But I really wanted to show highlights of Stedman's speech, which was just as phenomenal as Senator Booker's. However, our video photographer was in the process of moving down to Florida and I wasn't able to get it by today's event. But let me say this, after that first event, I wanted to reach out for the second speaker, which being that, you know, Corey was going to be big shoes to fill. I reached out to Professor Gates at Harvard, who had just met several months earlier at a function I was serving at the time as the treasurer of the University of Penn Black Alumni Society. And he said, "Oh, sure, I'll make it, I'll come." So I called his office, as well as calling Byron Stevenson, whose brother is a history professor at Penn, to see if I can recruit one of the two. And thank goodness, both of them were booked up for the next year. Because I ran across on the internet, New Jersey Black Cultural and Heritage Initiative Foundation. And I said, what is this? I've never heard of this before. Come to find out, Stedman, who lived in New Jersey, is where he's born at. I never knew Stedman was from Jersey, was affiliated with this, that Senator Rice had signed legislation back in 2005 when Secretary Wells was in office. So I am so glad that I had the opportunity and that other people stood me up and Stedman came through because now we have been moving to some much bigger and better things. The third marker, located at Cooper's Point, was unveiled September 2020 on the Camden waterfront. This too was well attended. Sandra Turner Barnes, God bless her soul. She was our poet as usual and beautifully reciting the Camden slave block. At the time we had Mayor Moran and Wasim Muhammad, president of the School Board of Education here in Camden, and our own chairman, Christopher Perks. It too was a beautiful affair. Going forward from here, for all those listening, you too can erect markers and do memorial plaques as well. Whether it's part of the New Jersey Underground Railroad or the contributions of people of African descent, not limited only to slavery, the great unmentionable, nor restricted to the state's colonial period. There are many unacknowledged African-American historical places of significance that we pass every day here in New Jersey. Without talking about this history, it's like looking oneself in the mirror with just one eye. We as a people, a nation, have to be long been selective on how we understand and talk about history. The reservoir of information and public acknowledgement will teach us who we once were and contextualize who we are, pointing us toward a better shared future. The future. The erection of the markers has led to an effort by Senator Graham, Secretary Way, and I to reestablish the New Jersey Black Cultural and Heritage Initiative Foundation, to be renamed the New Jersey Black Heritage Foundation, with other board members of Wendell Wright, professor at Stockton State College, Ralph Hunter of the African American Museum in Atlantic City, and Joe Jacobs. The foundation will finance the true expanded narrative of African Americans in New Jersey through education, culture, and the arts. There's a great deal of time and money, even here at the Camden County Historical Society, to commemorate the 250th anniversary here in New Jersey. And I promise you, the role of enslaved Africans played in development of the state will not be ignored. As I mentioned earlier, stated earlier, I too am Henry Mathis. You know, in the movie Amistad, Singay is a member of the Mende people. And he explains that when Africans invoke the names of ancestors, they will come. And I remember Anthony Hopkins, most favorite quote I've ever read in a historical movie. He stated that we have long resisted asking you for guidance. Perhaps we feared that by in doing so, we might acknowledge that our individuality that we so revere is not our own. Perhaps we feared that seeking their advice would be signs of weakness. But we've come to understand this is not so. Finally, we understand now, we've been made to understand and to embrace this understanding that who we are is who we were. I, at this point, consider myself Henry Mathis every day of the week. If you don't take anything else away from my presentation, I implore you, I beseech you to remember this. If you ever come across a situation whereby you're confronted with a problem where there seems no hope at all, I say invoke the name of your ancestors, your historical DNA, so they can bring their wisdom and strength that they fathered to come to your aid. Because at this present moment, I am the only reason that Henry Mathis has existed at all. This is dedicated to Sandra Turner Barnes. Salt of the earth, salt of the earth. Camden's poet laureate, who recently passed away. The board here at the Camden County Historical Society recently approved renaming our African American room in her honor. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce her daughter, RJ. She will recite her poem, Camden Slave Block. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I will be reading Camden Slave Block, written by Sandra Turner Barnes.
Breathing.
Much more than merely flesh and bone was paraded and sold here upon the stone. The hearts and souls of our African nations, the hopes and dreams of our future generations, valued less than cattle or livestock, purchased right here on Camden Slave Block. Brilliant Black minds tormented on evil slave ships, beautiful Black bodies broken by bloody bullwhips, our language stolen, our tongues taught to lie. They silenced our drums, laughed when we cried. Our values, our morals, they ignored or mock. Thought they brought those too on Camden Slave Block. A Black mother cried here every cell day. Her own children cruelly snatched and sold away. Her breasts would now have new mouths to feed, her womb forced to nurture the slave master's seed. And each night her shackles he unlocked, his property purchased here on Camden Slave Block. Here many a Black man hung his head in shame, his family ripped apart, his manhood never the same. Chained hand and foot and about his neck, those he dearly loved, he was unable to protect. In his own land, brave and strong as rock, but not here on Camden's cruel slave block. That was nearly 300 years ago, and yet only a few blocks away, a tragic life continues for many poor Blacks today. Though Master has moved on with his stolen wealth, he set in place systems that keep us enslaving ourselves. So we've never been set free of slavery's time clock or allowed to walk away whole from Camden Slave Block. They forbid us to read and yet dared us to die. So for some, reading's not as important as getting high. They still take away dignity, replace jobs with guns. Who's dying on the block today? Lord, we're not the only ones. Can't you hear history screaming? Tick tock, tick tock. You see, no one is free of Camden's slave block. Blacks in America will ever carry slavery's residue, but slave owner descendants, today there's new shame on you. There are so many history lessons to be taught, humanity lessons to be learned. You inherited the wealth and privilege that our ancestors earned. And today, the future stands waiting here on this historical spot as we begin this healing process from Camden's slave block. Without fear, here on Camden slave block. Yes, Lord, we're finally here again on Camden slave block. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mcdowell, and thank you, Mr. Davis. Ms. McDowell's remembrance of her mother, Sandra Turner Barnes, is a part of our whole impetus behind this project in this panel tonight, to remember all of our ancestors, celebrate our community members, our local community members who work to create history in New Jersey, and to learn more about this history. We believe that this is a part of making a robust democracy. At this time, I would like to again encourage people, if they have questions, to please put them in the Q&A. Also, I will put any kind of links or information in our chat. So please join me in welcoming Mr. William Galetta. I will now read his bio. Mr. Galetta is an independent researcher specializing in 17th and 18th century slavery in Perth Amboy. Mr. Galetta is a Perth Amboy resident. Perth Amboy resident, native born and raised. He graduated from Perth Amboy High School, attended Montclair University, earning a Bachelor of Arts in Humanities, and received a Master's of Arts degree in International Affairs and Development from the New School for Social Research, or the New School University, which is also my alma mater, in New York City. For more than 30 years, he has been researching and reconstructing 17th and 18th century Perth Amboy history as a slave entrepot, using primary and secondary sources. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. Galetta. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. First, I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to share Perth Amboy's role in the 17th century African slave trade. In 1686, the 300-ton ship Mariner's Adventure is, so far, the first recorded entry of a ship carrying enslaved people from the island of Madagascar off the East African coast into New Jersey at Perth Amboy. And here's a map showing the Cape of Good Hope to the left, and Madagascar is up to the upper right-hand corner, and there's a blow up, I believe, below it. Okay, next slide. And here is a map of Sandy Hook Bay, New York Harbor, and where the arrows are drawn, the first arrow on the bottom is Sandy Hook, and the second arrow points up to Amboy. Now, I should have put a third arrow in, but at Sandy Hook to the right, if you can follow, you can see Staten Island. And further to the right, and a little down, you can see New York City. So in other words, ships coming in from the open sea could either make a right and go into Manhattan, New York, or go left at Sandy Hook and enter into Perth Amboy. Most historical research in New Jersey focuses on the 18th century, the 1700s. Next. My focus is on eyeballing the 17th century in Perth Amboy and life in the everyday taverns, docks, and streets. I believe this story unveils a major find in Perth Amboy and the state of New Jersey's earliest history. Secondly, I've used primary sources mainly and a few secondary resources, but in this presentation, they're all primary resources to show the links between government and wealthy merchants and the communications that would make this global business connections possible in the 17th century, as they do today. Located between New York and Philadelphia, Perth Amboy was duty-free and without enforcement of smugglers and interlopers. It was an easy place to land enslaved peoples in New Jersey. Next slide. Actually, can you go back to the previous slide? The Mariner's Adventure, the voyage of the ship Mariner's Adventure began from the island of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean in mid-March of 1686. In a voyage around Cape d'Esperanza, the Cape of Good Hope, one of the most notoriously treacherous roundings in the world. The scheme was to clandestinely slip around Sandy Hook, New Jersey, avoiding New York taxes and unloading her cargo of enslaved people, 11,000 pounds of ivory, and a bale of raw silk that the Mariner's Adventure found floating on the high seas about 20 leagues from land off the Cape of Good Hope. Should be a comma. Anyway, they're bringing the ship into the newly crowned seat of government at Perth Amboy in East Jersey. Next slide, please. Origins of a slave entrepot at Perth Amboy. The first recorded ship carrying enslaved people into New Jersey arrived in the 17th century at Perth Amboy in July 1686. The ship was named Mariner's Adventure. William Williford, captain and commander. Now the Williford name, as it's spelled here, is correct as it is in his own will, which I obtained from Great Britain Q, which is the National Archives. It's also spelled Williford, Williford, in a couple other ways. So Williford was captain and commander of the Mariner's Adventure in July 1686. Next. Now the brothers, John and Samuel Winder, were agents for wealthy New York sponsors, Frederick Philipse. His real name was Flipson. He changed it to Philipse. Sounds a little more uppity. And Edward Antill, as well as New York Governor Thomas Dongan. So they're all in on the scheme. John Winder was one of the original incorporators of the new Royal African Company, RAC, a merchant at Cape Coast Castle, Guinea, chief factor at Whydah, I hope I said it right, and also served as an agent at Accra and Camden, two other Gold Coast factories. Now, Samuel Winder, his brother, was a merchant and occasional attorney from New York. He married Margaret Rudyard, the daughter of East Jersey Deputy Governor Thomas Rudyard. Samuel Winder later became chief counselor of East Jersey and moved to a plantation of 1,000 acres at Cheesequake, New Jersey, roughly 9 miles nautically south of Perth Amboy. Next, please. Now here you see the pedigree of the Winder family, and I have the three encircled. You can see the top is John Winder, the father. He was born in Southampton and came to New York, where he was a merchant and an alderman. Now to the left, John Winder of London, merchant. So that's John Winder Sr.'s son, went to Cape Coast Castle, Guinea. And his will was probated 1686, and August 23rd appoints blah, blah, blah. Okay, he was, now we look to the right. Samuel Winder, gentleman, provincial councilor of East Jersey, married Margaret Rudyard, who was, again, the deputy governor's daughter. So you see how connections work. That's the pedigree. And now, next, please. Now here's a blow up. John Winder of London, merchant, made of Cape Coast Castle, Guinea. Will probated August 23rd, 1686, appoints Sir Henry Toast. There's your connections between the two brothers. Now, John Winder was at Cape Coast Castle, Guinea, which is the west coast of Africa. His brother, Samuel Winder, wasn't quite as an explorer, or whatever you want to call it, but he went to Perth Amboy, New Jersey, instead of Africa. Next, please. Okay, now this is the smoking gun. In a letter sent to New York Governor Thomas Dongan from John Winder of Cheesequake, New Jersey, one of the Winder brothers, he reveals an obvious attempt to avoid New York's customs tax by smuggling an untold number of enslaved people from Madagascar and 11,000 pounds of ivory into Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Unfortunately, the 300-ton ship Mariner's Adventure is boarded and the ivory seized by the pilot sloop Beaver, William Plague, master. The collector of customs, Lucas Santon, is also aboard the Beaver. The ship is entered at Perth Amboy, where Winder agrees for the Negroes, and the ivory is taken to New York's Custom House. An affidavit given by William Williford, master of the ship's Mariner Adventure, says he traded in no port belonging to the Royal African Company. Next slide. So there's your connections between the two Winder brothers and the governor of New York. Now here is a case file from the Dongan Papers, the humble petition of William Williford, commander of the ship's Mariner Adventure. And you can see the date is September 15th, 1686. And what it is when the Mariner's Adventure came into Perth Amboy, the slaves were unloaded, and the ship Mariner's Adventure and the captain and the crew were piloted into New York City. The 11,000 pounds of ivory was taken to the customs house in New York City and held. An affidavit by Williford was signed that he traded in no port belonging to the Royal African Company. Meanwhile, approximately 140 slaves were dropped off in Perth Amboy. 11,000 pounds of ivory dropped off in New York at the customs house, and one 140-pound bale of silk, which the Mariner's Adventure crew and captain found floating off the Cape of Good Hope, was also brought to the New York's Custom House. Now, this case mentions nothing about ivory. It does mention Negroes on board, not landing in Amboy, but this case is a case brought on by the crew against Captain Williford for not getting paid wages, for beatings that they all sustained at sea, and for a split of the bale of silk which they found off the Cape of Good Hope. Next, please. Now here's an original from Kew in England, which is the National Archives, and it's a little tough to read on the right, so I transcribed it on the left. And what it says is Cornelius Creek, mariner, age 27 or thereabouts, being deposed upon oath, saith that in Sandy Hook was taken on board the sloop that piloted the ship, Mariner's Adventure, that was a sloop Beaver, into Sandy Hook, from on board the said Mariner's Adventure, 11,000 weight of teeth. And you can see the date, if you look on to the right, It's August 1686. That was his affidavit. Next, please. Now, this is one of the first anti-slavery, I guess you would say, booklets written, and it was written in 1715. And it says, and it was written by John Hepburn. And now, reader, going to show you thee a wonder. This is all in quotes. That is, in 30 years, I've been in America. Now let's stop here. 30 years. So 30 years from 1715 would be 1685. He would have been in Perth Amboy when the Mariner's Adventure arrived. So in the 30 years I've been in America, this practice has been carried on in almost profound silence. I've laid dormant above this 30 years. That sounds like myself. I was silent so long because I waited for my betters to undertake the works. And if any had appeared in this work, it is like I had been silent still. In other words, no one's written anything, so he had to do it. Referring to the few earlier publications, he complains, but most of all, those writings, I doubt, are destroyed by Negro masters, that the reader will find them almost as scarce to be found as the phoenix egg. Now remember, John Hepburn, again, writing 30 years after he arrived in Perth Amboy in 1715, puts him back to 1685. Mariner's Adventure came in July 1686. And that's from the American Defense of the Christian Golden Rule, or an essay to prove the unlawfulness of making slaves of men by him who loves the freedom of the souls and bodies of all men. And it's John Hepburn, 1715. Okay, next slide, please. The Mariner's Adventure is the first ship so far recorded ship into the Perth Amboy and New York harbors in July 1686. Most start and even voyages to Madagascar, if you look in books or on the internet, start in the 1690s. So this might have been a trial ship. And what they were going to do with the 11,000 pounds of ivory, well, we knew what they would do with the 140 enslaved people. Probably sent a lot of them up to Bergen County, Monmouth County, which had big agricultural plantations. And in Perth Amboy also had a few plantations. Plus, they could build the new capital, which was moved from Elizabethtown to Perth Amboy in 1686. So they could help build the new capital because labor was scarce. They couldn't get people to come to Perth Amboy to do work. People worked on their own plantations rather than building docks or homes for governors or homes for the gentry. Anyway, next slide, please. Okay, and this is just my contact. William Galetta can be contacted. Bill Williams 1157@gmail.com. And I want to thank you again for allowing me to hopefully enlighten a few people.
Thank you, Mr. Galetta. It's fascinating because actually one of the questions that was posed in the Q&A hit precisely on one of the things that you said in the talk, and that was asking where were did some of the enslaved people who came through these ports go to? So it's good that we were able to answer that. We'll answer more questions at the end of our presentation. And thank you very much for. So now I will introduce Ms. Ann Chinn. Ms. Ann Chinn was born and grew up in Washington, D.C. among family and friends with a strong awareness of history and community responsibility. Her accomplishments included writing a family history, Years in Telling, It's in the Blood. In 2011, she established the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to honoring African ancestors who experienced the Middle Passage, those who died and those who survived from whom we are descended. With remembrance ceremonies and marker installations at documented US arrival locations between 1526 to 1860. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College, the Yale University, master's program in health planning and hospital administration. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Chinn. Welcome, Ms. Chinn.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being on this panel, and I've previously worked with both Mr. Davis and Mr. Galetta. It's an honor. New Jersey, never forget. The quote is, if the Atlantic were to dry up, it would reveal a scattered pathway of human bones, African bones, marking the various routes of the Middle Passage. We want to remember our ancestors. And before I go any further, I simply want to say that we never, in our project, refer to the captive Africans as slaves. That is a status that I never accept in terms of defining them. They were people held in bondage, they were captive, and they were enslaved. Next slide. We were established, as you were told previously, in 2011 to commemorate and remember the 2 million captive people who perished in the crossing known as the Middle Passage, and the 10 million who survived the Middle Passage, from whom many of us descend. To the United States territories, which include the mainland of North America, the US Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, 500,000 children, women, and men arrived. So far, we have identified 55 arrival locations. They're documented primarily through the Voyages Slave Trade Database. We say that we are addressing the transatlantic human trade. And this history extends now with the inclusion of Puerto Rico from 1519 to 1860. On the mainland, from New Hampshire to Texas, as Mr. Galetta very succinctly showed, this was an international, global economy that was being established. We are still living with that model today. Presently, there are 30 locations, arrival locations, where the markers have been installed. Our job, our project job, is to install markers and hold these remembrance ceremonies. We have found repeatedly that people don't know the Middle Passage history. They think that we're only talking about slavery and that it is confined primarily to the South. None of that is true. And both Camden and Perth Amboy are now designated as UNESCO Slave Route Project Sites of Memory. The picture to your left is the unveiling, which Mr. Davis previously showed, and to the right are the young people, because we really insist that young people have to be included, to be encouraged to know their history, know this history of this country, and to take pride in who they are. So this is the group of high school students at the day that the marker ceremony was held in Perth Amboy. And I really like the sense that you can see that these are young people involved in promoting and knowing their history. Next, please. Africa is an ancestral home for many of us. So that when Peter Tosh says, anywhere you come from, as long as you're a Black man, you're an African. The New Jersey transatlantic data, and that is all that we focus on. We don't focus on ships that brought people from the Caribbean or from the other portions of the Americas or from Europe. Only those ships that brought captive children, women, and men to North America. So it's a direct transport. And you can see that Perth Amboy and Camden are the places, starting, as Mr. Galetta said, in 1686 and ending in Camden in 1764. The people came from all over West and East Africa, different places. And I sort of describe this voyage akin to Federal Express, United States Post Office. Sometimes there were numerous stops and deliveries before they finally emptied the ship. Middle Passage was horrific. It was saturated with violence and terror. Our ancestors suffered that. Next slide, please. This is, and I don't think people realize it, the largest forced migration in human history. From Central and Coastal Africa, 24 million people over a period of 400 years were taken from their homes and transported to the coast of East and West Africa primarily. Half of them died before they ever got to the coast to be placed on ships. 12 million were placed on ships. 2 million died during the ocean voyage. 10 million survived and arrived in Europe and the Americas. And 500,000, only 500,000, arrived on the US territories. The great bulk of the people were transported to Brazil. And you can see there's an image of a coffle, people being taken to the coast, then on the coast put into canoes and placed on these ships that would transport them, sometimes journeys, or they were in the hold for at least 6 weeks, and often for months. So the nations that were involved in this trade, this is your international economic model: Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands, Denmark, and the United States. Next slide, please. There is a shared history for our ancestors who are part of the diaspora. Each person experienced the largest forced migration in human history, the complete loss of liberty, human and civil rights. For the most part, the permanent removal from home, family, community, and state. This was a social, cultural, physical, emotional, and psychological near death. And throughout this entire process, there were innumerable attempts through accepted and legally sanctioned methods of violence and terror to eliminate identity, culture, and humanity as they had known it. And right here, I want to say, because when people talk about the slavery as dehumanizing, that is not true, in the sense that those who wanted to profit from slavery, those who participated in slavery, were well aware that they were dealing with human beings. They wanted these human beings under their control so that they could profit and benefit from human knowledge, human skills, and human labor. And the reason that I say this is because they're asking, or they're requiring, there's no ask, they are requiring captive people to do the work that human beings provide, to build the places where human beings lived. This was not a removal or an attempt to remove humanity. It was a move to control it and then to put a system in place that could continue this terrible exploitation of our ancestors. And those who arrived on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of this nation suffered generational enslavement based on race and ethnicity to legally maintain throughout the colonies, and it was later continued by the United States government. The exploitation of their skills, knowledge, and bodies without compensation at labor camps, I never call them plantations, and farms, in homes and urban workplaces as providers of care and service, and then through lease agreements as sources of wealth for others. And additionally, there was a reversal of the cultural roles of people in African societies. However, our ancestors on this land forged other cultures, other languages, and had more impact than we are aware or have ever acknowledged previously. I think Project 1619 helped open the eyes of a lot of people. It is truth telling. It talks about the impact of Africans on our culture, on our economy, socially, and I will say more in the next slide, I think, please. New Jersey talks about slavery, resistance, and legal emancipation. African slavery in New Jersey began with the English. In 1788, the importation of enslaved Africans to the state was banned, and free Blacks were not allowed to settle. 1800, New Jersey's enslaved population exceeded 12,000. That's on record. Most, approximately 75%, were distributed to the labor-scarce counties of Bergen, Essex, Middlesex, Hunterdon, Somerset, and Monmouth. I think someone had asked where these Africans primarily lived. In 1804, the state adopted what was a gradual emancipation program that remained legal for 50 years, except for newborn children after 1804. So gradual emancipation law required persons born into slavery to remain as enslaved until their 21st or 25th birthday. And you know, Black people were not writing the records. So when your 21st or your 25th birthday occurred is not always the truth. And so many enslaved children became wards of the state in the 1820s and 1830s. By 1830, 2/3 of all enslaved people living in the North were in New Jersey. January 23, 1866, exactly 156 years, 1 month from today, New Jersey ratified the 13th Amendment. It was the last northern state to abolish slavery, and they had to do a rerun. The first time that it was up for a vote, it was not passed. So this is the second time that the vote comes up and the state finally ratifies the 13th Amendment. But it took New Jersey legislature in 2008 to acknowledge the state's role in the history of slavery in the United States. Next slide, please. Truth telling. because that's what we're really about in terms of this history. People don't know this history. They don't know the full story. African ancestors and their descendants made the United States great. Anything that is positive comes with or from our African ancestors. I learned recently from a scholar, Paul Lovejoy, in his writing, and I was blown away. African women are the mothers of the Americas. Native women, indigenous women were dying from disease and territorial expansion. European women were a minority. African women were the women until 1830, producing the most children from African fathers, European fathers, and Native fathers. But African women were giving birth to the children in the Americas. So that I say to people, if your family's been here for more than 3 generations, you are descended from an African woman, or you certainly have African descended relatives. Sheila Walker, I think, puts it aptly when she talks about our ancestors. They were part of the agriculture. They were part of the technology. They were part of the economy. They were part of the creation of languages. They were part of defining the nature of the spiritual. They were part of the creation of all the cultures and forms and styles in which all European and African immigrants organized themselves and expressed their identities. One example that I will give in terms of the effect that Africans had on language is that if you go to any other former British colony, and that could be Australia, New Zealand, even in the West Indies, and in West Indies, you listen to the English that is spoken. There is no British accent. And that's because until the 1830s, the majority of people living in the Americas were either Native American or African. So when they say English now, it's an American English. When you say Spanish now, you have to say the American Spanish. And it's because of the presence and the influence of African culture and language to this day. Next slide, please. Why is US Middle Passage history even important? Well, we live in a racialized society. We live in a nation that was a slave nation. You can't back away from that. Race as a theory was developed and applied in the Americas, and in particular in the United States. Racialized also enforced racism. There is a hierarchy that was established for a purpose. It was a means to control and prevent resistance of Africans and their descendants. And it was also a way to protect and maintain what is basically European descended supremacy, or what is normally called white supremacy. Law and order was not based on ideals. It was based on control and the protection of one group against another group. And in this country, the white against the black. Today we speak of a minimum wage. That is a direct result of being historically a nation that depended upon slavery. There's no real discussion. In fact, there's pushback when you say living wage. You talk about destroying the economy. That's not true. More people have more money, they'll be able to buy more things and support themselves. You know, we have to reframe our thinking. We have to understand that we are very much conditioned by our history. When Mr. Davis said our DNA is also historical, we are going to have to face up to that. Right now, we're grappling with identifying, protecting, and providing basic human rights, but we haven't agreed on what those human rights are. Very easily, what comes to mind: education, health, employment, housing, and legal justice. None of those things are guaranteed or assured. Even though we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that doesn't translate to the welfare, and I'm talking welfare of all people in this nation. I hope that change is coming. It's up for grabs. Senator Booker said, it's time. And I say, if you're not ready, time means nothing. We have to be educated. We have to establish and then hold up our values, the things that our ancestors carried with them through many, many centuries. So in the sense of Sankofa, learn from the past and go forward wisely and ready. I thank you, because I really want to open this up for questions from those of you who are here.
Thank you, Ms. Chen. That was a powerful presentation. And we look forward to sharing it. People are asking us in the Q&A if we will be sharing these presentations. I posted a link for our YouTube page. This will probably be uploaded by next week. So before we go to the question and answer, Ms. Mcdowell is going to do a presentation, and then we'll go to question and answer. I would just like to say before Ms. McDowell's presentation that our question and answer will probably go over until 7:35. So you all are free to stay or do as you may, but we would like to thank you for coming. So Ms. McDowell, thank you very much for presenting again.
Thank you. This next poem that I'm going to do, it's a short one, but it gives a little bit about the history in this country where Black men and women were considered property, and we were not allowed to own property, lease property, or even get married. So this poem is entitled Genocide, and it talks about the Black family and the history in this country. So just to give you a little bit, scientists in identifying endangered species, they speak of danger to this entire planet and its inhabitants. Should certain bugs, worms, weeds, or animals become extinct? Really? Well, consider this. This never new effort to vanquish the darker hue, genocide. I am a generous Black woman. Mama taught me to be kind and to share with those less fortunate those few things which were mine. But when very fortunate white women, with their choice of fine, rich white men, pursue instead our few Black males, already outnumbered by 10, then I become a selfish Black woman in view of this never new genocide, Black men losing their identities and then taking themselves a white bride. Now, people, please don't misunderstand. I believe in charity and equality, but how the hell can I be willing to share when there ain't even enough for me? And when those men vanish from their own communities, they can't be free. We've lost too many of our men already to centuries of white injustice and death. So how are Blacks to survive in America when there are so very few Black men left? Just look at our Black communities and all the things that we lack: the wisdom, leadership, and strength of good men who are Black. Consider our Black families. There's really only one thing that we need, and that's men with true compassion and love, Black men to take the lead. And listen, too many of our Black children, they are angry, lonesome, and sad. These children all need strong role models, Black men they can proudly call dad. And then there are millions of Black sisters living this lost and lonely life, never knowing the love of a righteous Black man, never fulfilling the role of wife. Yes, I am a sassy Black woman, and the love of my people I will not hide. So I speak out in anger, wisdom, and yes, truth in view of this never new effort to vanquish the darker hue. Yes, I'm saying it because I'm Black and I'm blue. Genocide. Thank you all.
Thank you for sharing your mother's poetry, Ms. Mcdowell. We honor you creating that space here. And we honor all of the panelists who are bringing all of our ancestor stories, expanding our knowledge. So now we're going to do the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. So I would like to welcome all of the panelists so we can take questions from the Q&A. Please join us. So I'm going to start with questions from the Q&A. So now that the markers have been erected, are there any reparations efforts in play regarding the families of the enslaved?
Are you asking specifically for in terms of New Jersey or national?
I believe that this is with regard to New Jersey.
Oh, okay, then somebody else will have to do that.
I believe this was posted during Mr. Davis's presentation.
Okay.
Mr. Davis and Mr. Galetta, please join us. Please join us. Thank you. So the question, Mr. Davis, was now that the markers have been erected, are there any reparations efforts in play regarding the families of the enslaved?
Oh, I'm sorry, I heard you, but I was just talking to Joshua in the background that, for example, here, we don't know the names of the enslaved captives. So I'm certain that it's hard for descendants of theirs to follow them to here, or to any of the slaves that were taken off the 3 slave courthouses in Camden, because we were just cattle. There was no, we might have had a sex, and whether we were, well, they're directly from Africa, so it's not like Alabama where they have mulatto or blind. So no, I'm not familiar of any.
Okay. Another question is, thank you for this presentation. I think Mr. Galetta addressed this earlier. Could you tell us where the enslaved were sold in Camden and Perth Amboy ended up? Plantations in the South or remained in New Jersey? I believe Mr. Galetta had indicated that they went to certain sites in New Jersey. Ms. Chen or Mr. Davis, do you have an answer?
I think that a lot of them, of course, went to the agricultural areas during the colonial period, but they also went to other colonies. They would have supplied Delaware, probably Pennsylvania, where the tariffs, you know, if they could get them in without having to pay a tariff, so that even though it's the same as in Africa, when you got on the ship, you did not come from that port. You may have come from anywhere. When you got off the ship, I mean, you talk about in routes, for example, the man comes from Virginia to Annapolis to purchase an enslaved person and carry him back to Virginia. So it's not that once you arrive in Perth Amboy or Camden, that you would have been necessarily staying within that colony.
Okay, thank you. To Mr. Davis, wow, it's incredible the work that you put in to make the history of New Jersey known. Personally, I'm on the search for letters and documents of New Jersey enslaved. Do you know the best sources to start my search? I guess this could also be to Mr. Galetta as well.
Camden County Historical Society has a wealth of information here, so they can go to our website, which is cchsnj.org.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Also, as far as letters and documents of the New Jersey enslaved, those are very challenging to find. Sometimes you can find them in other archives outside of New Jersey. So I would suggest searching other archives, doing internet searches on various archives. I know for me, it was challenging to find letters, but as far as documents regarding New Jersey enslaved, digital.mpl.org at the Newark Public Library has documents that show the manumission records of the children, I'm sure a small percentage of the children who were freed with the Gradual Abolition Act. As everyone knows, all of the people born before 1804, though, who continued to be enslaved and were not sold to the South or did not pass away, stayed enslaved until after the 13th Amendment. So the Gradual Abolition Act kept anyone enslaved who was enslaved at the time of the Gradual Abolition Act. Linda Shockley asked, are there any more plans for other markers in Camden County or elsewhere in the state?
We've documented the actual location of the auction houses here in Camden and Perth Amboy. There was a total of 4. So getting back to my earlier comments, there's a wealth of history here in New Jersey that the foundation will be leading this effort just to, commemorate and place markers and other memorial plaques across the state of New Jersey where, historically African-Americans have been involved in some form of capacity, whether it's the arts, culture, or history. So yeah, there will be more markers, but no more slave auction markers specifically.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have no picture though.
Oh, no, we can see you.
There you are. There you are.
Oh, you okay?
Yeah, and Mr.
Oh, I'm not on my own screen, huh?
Yeah, but.
Oh, okay. I'm on the big part. I'm looking at the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay, the other thing that I wanted to mention here when someone was asking about records, if you go to the National Archives,
Well, sure.
they have detailed information by region, and they are in particular identified as almost the Black census. So if you have a name and you have a place where they were living, if you know that, you may be able to trace that way too. I was just in a presentation in Texas where a person from the National Archives informed us about that.
Thank you. Mr. Galetta, someone asked during your presentation, where were the ships constructed? Were they made in New Jersey?
I have no idea.
You can
No,
go.
they
If
were
you go
international ships. They definitely weren't made in New Jersey.
Yeah,
They were
if-
probably English.
in England.
England. Yeah, English ships that were these guys. The particular was what they call an interloper. He worked for everybody. He worked for the Royal African Company. He worked for himself. He worked with the pirates. He made that trip, and they basically grabbed him for it. From Madagascar to Perth Amboy, And that was, you know, they caught him off Sandy Hook. They were waiting for him. They had a pilot boat waiting. Now you figure, where's the communications there? And now this guy, Winder, Sam, who lived in Cheesequake, not Chesapeake, Cheesequake, he wrote a letter to Dongan, the governor, saying that he was going to, sorry, I couldn't meet you in Amboy after I took the sloop Amboy and I missed you there. But so I went aboard the ship from Madagascar and met, you know, they said, he just said with the captain and the collector of the New York port, Santon, and they left their, go ahead. They
Oh, no,
left
I was just listening.
they left their enslaved in Perth in Amboy. And basically the pilot boat captain grabbed the silk and they took the ship into the city and 11,000 pounds of ivory. They call it teeth.
Okay.
Were
The
taken
other-
to the New York Customs House and held there until word from England. And word from England was send the whole ship back with everybody aboard it. Now, this ship was in West Africa in 1683. I know, and it had the same cook, Cornelius Creek. He was a cook. He was cook in 1683. He was cook in 1686 in Perth Amboy. So that's why I know it's the same ship, same guy. You know, Williford the captain, Cornelius Creek the cook. He was on board with an English woman in Africa when the pirates came. The whole crew happened to be aboard. You know, and he got away with that one. And then I believe he's in maritime law. And I looked up a couple of the maritime law files on him, and it's a Barton versus Williford. It's the same person. It'll say it's the same person. And it's about robbery at the high seas and gold being robbed from him and saying pirates took it. And I think they let him go with that one. And it's also about Williford being, when he was in West Africa, talking to writing both Winder, John Winder, the chief of the station, and Williford were writing like diverse letters against. He says, "Oh, he won't give me." Says, "Oh, this one won't. I can't get him." He said, "Search for yourself." You know, he said, "You go," and like really. And then the next 3 years later, it just so happenstance that John Winder from West Africa and the captain of that, then it was called the Lisbon Merchant. It's the same ship, it's the Lisbon Merchant. He was on the Lisbon Merchant with Winder, around Winder, and then he wound up in 1686, 3 years later, at Madagascar, and the ship came into Perth Amboy as the Mariner's Adventure.
Yeah. The other thing is that when you were asking, someone was asking about where these ships are constructed. If you go on the Voyages, Transatlantic Trade, Human Trade, or Slave Trade database,
Sorry, it's wind blowing.
in that they will tell you where the ship was constructed.
Okay.
Well, I was one who entered the database, the Mariner's Adventure. I was one who got it entered in through evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like,
I complete. I don't know why. I sort of had completed. There's more. I mean, I could give you the number of the crew.
Yeah.
You know, the names of the crew. I can give you a lot of information on that. Yeah, I got that ship entered. You never
well,
knew about.
definitely when when we upload the video, I'm going
I
to,
also sent him he also got sent something else that should help him identify other ships and other captains.
Right.
I
okay.
can't really mention, you know.
I just want to say, when I'll solicit any links from the panelists, when we upload the video so that people will be able to get more information that we put in the chat. I see people have asked for the information in the chat. I think if we have just 2 more minutes, I don't know if, and this will be our closing question and before we say goodnight. Someone asked, 1519, I thought the first year a slave ship arrived was in 1619. I'm sure Mr.
Tell 'em, man. Tell 'em, man.
No, you see,
Really?
what's happened to this
Favorite
country
question.
is that we are so entrenched with the British history
Right,
that
Right.
we don't realize
Correct.
the Spanish were here first.
right.
Sure, they were here.
And so 100 years before
Right.
the British came, or the English came, Spain, 1513, they were arriving in what was Florida.
Right.
But by what we're talking Middle Passage history, that starts in Puerto Rico in
Mhm,
1519, because that was an administrative center for the Spanish
mhm.
Empire. And then in 1526, you have another shipment recorded going into Sapelo Bay in Georgia, South Carolina area. So no, 1619 only talks about British history. And you
Mhm.
gotta push us way back.
Yes. And I would just like to, on that note, I would just like to say thank you from the New Jersey Historical Commission, Secretary Way, to all of the panelists, and to Ms. Mcdowell for presenting, and to all of our audience who attended this evening, for sharing this Black History Month program with us this evening. We will upload this video to our New Jersey Historical Commission YouTube webpage probably by next week, along with links from all of the organizations and folks that are affiliated here, as well as any other links they would like to share. And so on that note, I would like to say good night to everyone.
Can I ask one question? If you have folks who have questions in there that need to be answered, is there some way that they can be distributed so that we can answer?
Let's see, Greer, can we print the question and answers out so we can circulate them?
Yeah, the Q&A is saved, so we will be able to access it after the webinar, and we can definitely share it with our panelists to get some answers to those questions, which we
Okay.
can then share as a resource with the recording.
Great, thank you so much, Greer. And so we will share that resource when we, in the responses to any of the questions that the panelists would like to submit when we upload the video.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.
And
Have a
stay-
good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye
Good
now.
working
I
with you.
forgot to say thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Have a good rest of the good night.
You too.